This is really exciting. It's so amazing to see, all the students, all this wonderful group of professionals engaging here and really working on what is, one of the most emerging threats for our nation and our society and our connected life, which is how do we skill, right? How do we skill? How do we train? How do we reskill? For me, I'm excited to talk with you today about a very specific area of passion for me, which has also been my introduction to the cybersecurity world, which is policy. And I'm sure that you're probably thinking is what's the connection between hacking and the law or hacking and policy? Well, it turns out there is a lot in the cybersecurity landscape that is dictated by future regulation, future policies, and in fact, it's a very vibrant area and domain in the legal space. And today, I want to be very focused about empowering you all to take part in this journey, to become a policy hacker, to think about how you can immerse yourself in this universe of cybersecurity regulations and policy, and really click down on why should you care. And I'm going to do this a little bit through my own personal story. So as you can probably already recognize by the accent, spoiler alert, yes, I am Israeli. Grew up in sunny Tel Aviv, spent some years in the Israeli Intelligence Forces 8200. You might have heard about that unit in the context of cyber professionals. Then spent some years in the photovoltaic solar energy industry and really became fascinated and passionate about this intersection between technology and the law. Then went and started a few degrees and also practiced law. Yes, I do have here a confession. I'm a recovered lawyer. So I did a lot of VC law, M&A law, technology law, and then I basically decided that I'm so passionate about that intersection between technology and the law that it's a great idea to go and get my 4th degree, which is a PhD in the law, and that's how I got to Berkeley, to sunny California, and my life changed. My life changed because I had the privilege and the honor to work with some of the most amazing professors out there on intellectual property and technology law, but also get connected with hackers, with computer scientists, with technologists that are really passionate about privacy and security. So I already talked about this intersection of technology and law, but this world has been also my opening path into cyber. And why? I was one of these people that spent all their time during their dissertation reading terms of use. And I bet you that our audience, our people, people in the room are probably fascinated because it's really hard to find those people that read the contract. I was one of these people, and I spent a lot of time focusing on the intersection between contracts and technology. But I also was excited about this idea that if you read privacy policies, if you read contracts, and you actually spend some time with hackers, there could be some phenomenal interactions that go in between. So just to give you one example of one of the research papers that I've done while I was at Berkeley, which is also an interesting story on how I got my own CVs and bug bounties, not for actually hacking the system, but collaborating with some gifted hackers and computer scientists and hackers. We took this world of privacy law, and specifically COPPA, which is a very important law on protecting children online, and we studied how the privacy policies and those laws are interacting with the actual practices of apps that are collecting PII information, sensitive information from kids. So we scraped the Play Store, the Android Play Store, and with an interesting orchestration, we were able to show what's the relationship between all those applications, what they say, what type of permissions they're getting, and what they're actually collecting. And these interactions, this interface between technologists and lawyers, and this paper really opened my mind to the implications that you can have once you collaborate between those domains, because that research ended up in a $120 million settlement for Google. They got sued by the Attorney General of New Mexico, and I was very fortunate to be one of the papers that contributed to a revision of the rulemaking on children privacy on the COPPA law. And really, it kind of opened my eyes to that power of that intersection. What happens when you take actual technologies and use them to enforce and think about policies at scale? That's the paper. You can check it out. I think it's already from 2018. And it also kind of opened my eyes to the world of bug bounties, because already in 2018, our bounty that we got, and if for those of you in the audience that are not familiar with the concept of bug bounties, this is a very amazing concept where individuals, anyone, can get paid for reports for vulnerabilities. We got our bounty from Meta for privacy violation. So that was a data abuse bug bounty because we looked at the privacy. And side note for you all, I think this is the future of research. So today we are seeing here amazing students, amazing professionals working on cyber, but the future of risk is holistic. And just from here, I'm going to Vegas to look at and participate in something really cool. It's the largest hacking event for large language models in collaboration with the White House. It's happening just next week. So stay tuned for this concept of algorithmic bug bounties and how we are taking the concept of bug bounties and expanding it to new worlds. And the connection to policy here is very concrete. Regulators are thinking about, they're seeing cyber, they're seeing what's happening in cyber, and they're thinking about the next evolution of regulation. And that's absolutely privacy and AI. And we're going to see the interaction of security practices like red teaming, like bug hunting, going into these domains. And in fact, for those of you who have been kind of paying attention, this concept that I coined in 2018 was just part of the 2023 White House announcement when we had the 7 large language model developers in the White House. Take a look at their voluntary statement. Guess what? One of the practices mentioned there in the 4-page kind of overview of the statements of what they're going to do is red teaming. So the concept of bug bounty is going to AI, and that's pretty exciting, especially for me, because I thought about it kind of 5 years ago to see how it's maturing. And this is one of the benefits of immersing yourself in the policy conversation. Because if right now you're thinking about cybersecurity and you are CISO and you're thinking about how to protect your environment, you're going to be starting to need to get to know the AI governance, the AI trustworthiness requirements, the privacy landscape that is coming from a different body of laws, and preparing yourself to that. And this is one of the innovative ways that cutting-edge companies like OpenAI are preparing themselves by leveraging their bug bounties and their red teaming for new areas. So I already talked about my passion to contracts, but how did I get to hacking? And how come I'm in this space? So I was at Berkeley doing tons of research and really fascinated by terms of use. And my sister tells me about this concept of bug bounty. And she's telling me a very strong message, a message that is really that room next to us is coming into life. She's telling me about the power of hackers and why we should be embracing the adversarial mindset. We should be thinking on how we are reaching hands to those security professionals and creating bridges to them. And I got fascinated by bug bounties. So what do? As a student of the law, I start reading contracts, many contracts of bug bounties. This was 2016 and 17, and my sister tells me about amazing people like my good friend Jack Cable. We just had CISA here, right? Jack Cable is a senior advisor to CISA, and he is one of the people behind the Secure by Design document that we just heard about from our fellow experts here. Very important initiative, but some of you might not know that already in age 16, Jack found his way into the government by hacking the Pentagon. And how was he able, in the age 16, to hack the Pentagon legally? Well, that's the concept of bug bounties. But he was sharing that one of the advantages of these regimes is that he would feel free and empowered to make sure that he's hacking but not getting sued, not having to hide the fact that he's hacking, but actually getting paid for it legally. So I was like thinking, okay, we have this major thing of bug bounties, and this is a big deal, but we also have this law called the CFAA. How many here in the rooms familiar? The computer, yeah, we have some hands. Well, anti-hacking laws. Turns out we have a lot of laws in the areas of computer crime that are actually in the business of creating criminal and civil liability for hacking. So how do we reconcile this need to cultivate security research at the highest level while also thinking about implications under the law? I digged into this. This was many years ago, but that's my path into cyber. I read a lot of contracts. I discovered they created a lot of legal liability for the hackers. And I co-founded with some fellow partners, Casey Alice and Chloe Medeski, a concept called Disclose.io. When I started this research, it was just a paper. This was 2017. I discovered that all these contracts are creating liability for the hackers. So you have a bug bounty contract that doesn't actually authorize the action of the hacker. So the hackers were submitting evidence under the CFAA and under anti-hacking laws and not getting explicit protections and consent for the hacking. And if we have some people in the room that are pen testers, you probably know that one of the most foundational things that you need to hack is a contract that allows you to hack and gives you that consent. And I was pretty shocked that we didn't have that arrangement when it came to bug bounty. So first thing I did is I did a paper, but turns out that's very academic and nice, doesn't change reality. So my sister told me, you got to spread the word and kind of create something more meaningful. And in fact, I created this Hall of Fame, right? Like we have right here a leaderboard for companies that are more kind of actively working with the community and have these explicit protections, but was really a pivotal point and kind of exposed me to the power of the community and the ability of hackers, right, to really engage in policy. Was the fact that I came to DEF CON, I came to these conferences like this, and I shared the message, and take into account I was only a student, and the hackers came together. The hackers formed coalitions and told to the big companies, we need to change this situation, and we can do it together. And that, by the way, is pretty fascinating because in the course of a couple years, we were able to collectively achieve something pretty meaningful. This research on Disclose.io and the importance to protect hackers ended up in the Supreme Court case. When the Supreme Court case on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act narrowed the interpretation, we were cited. And in the course of a couple of years from an idea, this is now the best practice in bug bounty and vulnerability disclosures, thousands of organizations adopted that concept. It's required by all federal agencies under CISA BOD, CISA Binding Operating Directive, that is requiring all federal agencies to have safe harbor and protections for hackers in vulnerability disclosure programs. And guess what? It's a best practice in that Secure by Design document. And maybe we will even see it in the European Parliament position on the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And I remind you, 5 years ago, it was a paper. Just a paper. That's the story. And for me, one of the reasons I'm telling that story, because if you told me as a student that this is where, some text and some ideas that I floated out there in 2018, that we have the power as a community to come together and change the law, I would probably be skeptical. But this is the power of what can be done if we all come together. You can read more about it online, but we had some early adopters and companies that really came together and moved that forward. Mozilla is one, Dropbox is one, Tesla is one actually, and this is how I got to meet Elon Musk and get this coin. So I really encourage you to check out the story. But I'm bringing you this story as an idea and as a kind of a path or a case study to empower you to dive into this world of policies. Because anti-hacking laws, for example, deeply impact hackers. So why should you immerse yourself in this world of policy? And what is really the tools or the landscape or the ideas that can empower you to become a policy hacker? So let's dive in. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of what's happening right now in the security policy world. We will dive on some of the latest documents. Of course, I am a lawyer, but not your lawyer. Someone told me that free legal advice is probably not legal advice. So this is not legal advice. But I want to dive into the world of security policy. And I think if you look at the overarching world of security policy, one thing we have to understand is a lot of the policy is not just laws. The things that impact technologies, the things that impact controls and standards that can really create market power are often standards. They're often best practices. So how many of you in the room are familiar with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework? We have a couple of hands. Big deal, right? Very influential. And by the way, going into revision, if you're not aware, NIST is revising what we call is the CSF, the Cybersecurity Framework, and they have now open comments on this. These are the type of documents, as we look at the landscape of security policy, that are very impactful. Laws and legislation are important, but how often do you think laws on cyber actually move and pass in the United States? How many a year that are focused on cybersecurity? Any guesses? about one or two. We just had CERCIA. That's the cyber incident reporting and ransomware payment reporting law for critical infrastructure. It was a nice opportunity to engage on that when I was the head of cyber policy at Intel and the chair of the ITI Cyber Committee, which is one of the committees that represents the entire global technology industry on cyber. And usually they pass a couple of years, they don't pass in what we call as due course, but rather as part of other laws that have to move. And a great example is the National Defense Authorization Act. So with every year we have this very big law that needs to pass with the budget for DoD, we call it the NDAA, and you will see some ideas on cyber that would pass at the federal level. But guess what? We have a lot of policy action that is happening on the executive branch and the administrative level. Executive orders. So you probably have heard about the Biden executive order from 2021. Big deal, right? After the SolarWinds attack, a lot of focus on supply chain. We now have, and it's public information, a big executive order that is being planned on AI, and what the community thinks that it's going to be not smaller than the cyber or even more comprehensive. So that's really exciting to see how that executive order is going to form. We should expect a lot of focus on privacy-enhancing technologies, PETs, a lot of focus on AI security, maybe even some elements of watermarking, maybe some conversations about what kind of technologies can support LLM in that regard. So that's kind of an overview of some of the things we have in this space. So these are laws, regulations, standards. Standards are super critical. ISO standards, ETSI standards, standards that are being developed with a community, or even consensus documents. So let me throw one at you. The MIDRA attack framework, right? Very critical document in this space. Consensus document. All these different documents are shaping the best practices. And why does it matter? Because if you are an organization and you're thinking about your liability and your risk, eventually you're going to be assessed by your customers, by your vendors, by your other ecosystem players that are working with you, by government, by regulators, right? Based on your ability to adhere and implement and often be ahead of what is considered the baseline. What are these best practices? And these are not just laws. What else? Contracts. Supply chain contracts. Very big deal. We have a lot of cyber requirements that today are getting pushed through the contractual chain. A lot of vendors, a lot of CISOs, a lot of companies are thinking how they can reduce the risk and shift the liability using very elaborate contracts that require controls from their vendors. And in fact, there are some resources in that space that are coming from policymakers like CISA and checklists that you can check them out and you can better understand what's going on in the landscape. And my favorite form of policy, which I think is the most powerful, code. Code. Code is a strong enforcer of the law and can shape the law. And what better example than encryption or digital rights management systems? So all these kind of areas we think about as we think about cyber policy. So let's dive in some of the key areas. Product security. A lot of people focus their attention on enterprise security or cloud security and are not very familiar with the area of product security regulation. That is a specific area, a passion of mine, that is going to explode. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the development. And I want to also specifically highlight this switch from reasonable security to baseline security measures. So the message that you're hearing from the government, the message that you're hearing from the White House is more responsibility, more specificity, more demonstrable security and measurability, and raising the type of technology controls and baseline security measures that you have to be in the product. Let me give you one concrete example. And I was fortunate enough to be there in the White House when this was announced and representing a group of entrepreneurial companies like Armis, like Clarity, and like 5DX. We just had an announcement of the White House US Cyber Trust Mark, a new label coming at you for all connected products, representing the cyber controls you can expect on these connected products. Very big deal. So this is a shift, and this is kind of a trajectory that is showing us the arc of cyber regulation. And I want to introduce you to a way to kind of predict where regulation is going, which is a lot of my passion. A lot of what I'm focusing my time today is building that technology that can predict and where regulations are going to go, but also allow startups and entities of all sizes to engage with policymakers. Once there is an attack, Log4j, SolarWinds, Mirai, what you should expect is a swift action and response from policymakers. They want to take action. And based on the attack, often you can predict what controls are going to be the focus. Software bill of materials. Anyone familiar here? Some hands? You're familiar? Thank you, sir. Supply chain security. In the aftermath of Log4j and SolarWinds, a lot of focus on supply chain security, a lot of focus on open source. Obviously, we can expect a lot more focused on requirements for software bill of materials from regulators. So what's interesting is an attack comes, industry reacts, government takes note, and then there is a wave of regulation, and then what can we see? Startups. Startups, investments, industry reacting, and this might take a few years to implement, but that's the point. Today, we can actually predict what are going to be the market drivers, what are going to be the technology controls, if we just learn to engage and understand that power of the policy landscape. Okay, so time check. How much time do I have, organizers? 15 minutes. Okay, so let's walk through some of the biggest trends. I already talked about CERCIA. Big deal because, you know, we didn't have a federal law passing on cyber on this area, I think, from 2015. So the last time we had a law that's focused on threat information sharing and creating liability protection was the Cybersecurity, I think it's called the Information Security Sharing Act from 2015. And then we had CERCIA. So this is the first time incident reporting requirements, not data breach, incident reporting requirements, cyber incident, by the way, defined pretty broadly. If you open up the law, you will not believe what kind of definitions you can find there. Zero-day vulnerabilities are defined in the law. Yes, the concept is actually defined in the law. And this law, CERCIA, is focusing on requirements for critical infrastructure players to report incidents within 72 hours. Now, this is but a part of a global trend. We are going to see an evolution of requirements on critical infrastructure players. And there are two things here: the nature of the requirements and how many entities are going to be considered critical infrastructure. So we are moving from an environment of maybe hundreds of thousands players to tens of thousands, both in the US and Europe. In Europe, we have an equivalent directive. Directive is something that needs to get implemented by all the states in Europe, but it's still very powerful, with GDPR-level fines. It's called the NIS2, and it's already in implementation. Same, incident reporting requirements, but also reporting for operational disruption because of the incidents in 24 hours. What else? Ransomware payment reporting requirements. Super interesting. If you're paying a ransomware, you're going to need to report that to CISA. And you know, these are some of the things that we're seeing, a very large focus on vulnerability management, incident reporting requirements across the board. But overall, this nexus of regulations on critical infrastructure providers and scoping, like really stretching out the definition of who's in scope. So IT companies, IT manufacturers that for years have tried to kind of stay away from that definition are going to be in scope. So big deal for vendors, a lot of opportunities there. Baseline security measures. I already talked a little bit about that. That's the desire from regulators to become very specific on what are the controls that are required, especially for products. IoT security, we're going to have a very important law in Europe. It's a regulation. So like the GDPR, it's going to apply across the board. It's called the EU Cyber Resilience Act, applicable to all connected products, defined very broadly. And all connected products going into Europe, not with the mechanism of fine, of after the fact, you have an incident, the regulator is chasing you. You cannot go into customs. You cannot enter the market in Europe if you don't have a self-attestation or certification for a comprehensive set of requirements, both process and on device. Data at rest protection, data at transit, encryption, stating the period of support, mechanisms of update, vulnerability disclosure programs, software bill of materials. These are just but the examples. Very detailed, very comprehensive, all connected products. Obviously, if you're a vendor, you should be preparing for that because this is coming 2026 and it's going to be applicable for all Europe. If you're a manufacturer, right now, you're designing products, right now, that are going to hit the market at that time point. How are you immersing yourself in that conversation? That's what we're focusing on open policy. Supply chain security, very critical, a new era for understanding risk management for supply chain and third-party vendors. SBOM is just by the beginning. Many of us that think about the concept of inventory management and being able to understand what you have in your stack and what you have in the product know is that identifying the components and the risk, that's just the first part. How do you incorporate that into your secure lifecycle development? How do you make sure that you enforce robust controls on your vendors? That's going to be a very critical conversation that is actually going to get intertwined with this idea of security measurability. So we are moving from a culture of, trust me, I'm the manufacturer, self-attestation. Just trust me on this. I'm telling you I got it. I have the controls, I got it. To certification, to third-party testing. And that's going to be very important for vendors that are selling security products to understand. But it's not just about mitigating the risk. It's about producing the artifacts for compliance. That's a big change, a sea change in how we think about security. And I like to call that the security measurability or the demonstrable security revolution. Vulnerabilities, super important. These are not incidents. Vulnerabilities, before they get exploited, they're just vulnerabilities. How do you engage with the wonderful security research community that we have just right there in the next room? How do you create pathways for hackers to work with you? How do you facilitate vulnerability disclosure programs and invite that and cultivate that industry, that community to work with you? That's that focus on hacker collaboration and also collaboration just between government and industry and between industry players. Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, likes to call it persistent collaboration, right? How do we all come together and constantly share information, threat information sharing? Tremendous focus on this from governments. JCDC is just one example. We're going to see that continued. And we're also going to see more bilateral and multilateral collaboration. Dr. El-Kuwaiti spoke about the ransomware, the counter-ransomware initiative from Ann Neuberger from the White House. Those are kind of frameworks where you have tens of countries coming together and sharing information in order to address the threats. We're going to continue to see that happening, and technology has a really critical role to play there. Okay, so I gave you just examples, a few examples, and we're short of time. So I want to focus you and just give you one document that you really need to read. And I just had, we're going to have a podcast or series on this, providing an overview on this. This is the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. Sure, we can also talk about the SEC rulemaking. We can talk about many initiatives. But I think the bottom line from government is they want more responsibility. And this is not just Europe, right? That is always kind of having very comprehensive, very specific, rights-based approach to security. This is the US. We are hearing about shifting the liability. We are hearing about the responsibility of manufacturers. And you can just check this wonderful document as basically a very clear roadmap to how we're going to achieve it. Software liability, a concept that we've been debating for years and didn't have any action on. Today, all software providers are just releasing the liability in the terms of use. That concept of software liability is going to get explored by the administration. Big shifts. I already talked about IoT. I don't want to expand. This is just but an overview on how much traction, how much regulations and standards we have in that space, all maturing to this really critical moment of the EU Cyber Resilience Act happening in Europe and the Cyber Trust Mark happening in the US. But this is building on years of regulation. And I do want to talk a little bit about the EUA Act and what we're going to see on AI, because it's not going to be divorced from cyber. It's going to be in that intersection. Holistic risk management, and very important issue for companies in cyber, CISOs to take a note of, what's going to be happening from the White House. I already mentioned the EU AI Act. I would say that is almost done, and I think that's going to pass, and there is already a body of standards that they are developing that are very relevant, and I think we're all staying tuned and waiting for the executive order that we're going to see on AI that is going to be very impactful. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about anti-hacking laws, but those of you who are really curious can hear a lot of what I've talked about with my good friend Hardy Geiger at B-Side San Francisco. We did a whole talk on that, and I am going to be at DEF CON talking about it. And I want to just spend a minute on my own passion. So this is a lot of information. And you're probably asking yourself, well, Amit, you have you have a PhD in the law and you've been doing this and you're barely keeping up, and you're right. It's really hard to immerse yourself in that universe. That's where the idea for open policy came. I spent the last couple of years really engaging, with global policymakers on behalf of an amazing large technology company, Intel. And this is in the midst of the passage of the CHIPS Act. So we had a lot of government relationship activities. And it became clear to me that although this is wonderful and we have to work with big tech and we have to make sure that they're engaged in a conversation, it is very hard for everyone else to be part of that conversation. Policy is right now a combination of many documents, many standards, many data points, not curated, not collected, and not made accessible to perhaps the most impactful players in this domain. You, individuals, entrepreneurs, unicorns, startups, professionals. So that's where the idea for open policy came. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company. We are aiming to be the world's first intelligence and engagement technology platform for policy. We believe that access to policy can be powered by technology, and we can leverage technology to better connect all these entities with policymakers that really want to hear from all these other entities. And we also believe that access to markets can be powered by policy, and that these conversations, the prediction of, or just the mere idea of understanding of what's happening in policy is a market differentiator, that if you're in security, if you are in a company that is working on technology, policy is impacting your roadmap, it's impacting your strategy. And just imagine what can you achieve if you can be open and kind of get that information, be part of the conversation, and maybe even shape it, maybe even engage. So if you want to hear more about what open policy is doing, you can check out our website. We are a little bit still in stealth, so not all the information is there, so reach out. We are proud enough to have some of our early customers here with us in the room, in the audience, and this is really exciting, and this is my personal passion. So I hope you stay tuned. And with that, I think we are done. So let's do this and open it up for questions, if we have them. I answered it all.
Well, I wouldn't go there. I have so many. Anyone from the audience? Okay, so I have to say, policy is, I told you it was getting better and better, and I have 23 years in the federal government and a couple outside of the federal government, so I've been on both sides of the policy making. I agree with you. It's a phenomenal time to be invested in this activity because the world is evolving very quickly, and I really thought the cogency you put together was really wonderful. What I would, I guess my question for you is, what piece of advice would you give the audience and perhaps policymakers about that sense of urgency that is created whenever there's a problem, right? There is that desire to act and to act quickly, and sometimes that desire to act quickly comes with consequences that you don't see later. So
that's a great question, and one that we have debated in the cyber policy industry. And by the way, any technology policy, you can have something in privacy, in sustainability, in trade, geopolitical issues emerge. There is a sense to react. I think there are two critical areas. Approaching these issues on a proactive posture, meaning you should constantly be on the lookout of these issues and build a multi-pronged, multi-year strategy. Because the swift action that would come after one attack is not going to be consistent enough to drive a whole market, let alone a whole global approach, because it can take years to prepare technology roadmaps, to meet regulations. So we constantly should be in the process of building a long-term strategy that is actually not just local, it's global, So, and I think this has been part of our challenge that, we have administration changing, and we have national cybersecurity strategies that are being developed and changed, and new strategy. So we have to make sure that we have that connectivity, between policymakers' actions. And we always have to engage. By engaging, I mean creating policies for our, the threats we are facing that are thoughtful is a very hard task. It requires engagement with academia, with hackers, with researchers, with individuals, comprehensive action plans. It's not just the laws, it's about the enforcement tools, right? It's about technologies, private industry. And it has to be a dialogue that is ongoing. One of my passions about open policy is doing two things: creating more market demand for more professionals in the space of policy, which is, by the way, pretty small, and B, creating a nexus of art that allows policymakers to engage with a much larger crowd, right, audience of participants in the conversation, and also track and measure using data so we don't lose that institutional knowledge that we had from prior research and public commentary and engagements, and we're actually tracking what moves the needle. So that persistent approach and kind of thinking about strategically and proactively, I think that's one issue. The other issue is resist the need to just react. You might have in your drawer already things that now have momentum to move. So instead of reinventing the wheel, go back to what you already had prepared. In a way, it's a little bit how we think about cyber incidents. Exactly, right? We shouldn't be we should have the playbook ready already, because we know that we can react to a cyber incident and do something that can actually create more problems, right? So I think there is a lot to be learned from that.